The engine goes quiet before the line. That is always the moment when the body notices everything at once. The cold comes back first, then the wind, then the loose trembling in the frame, different without the steady pull of power. Hands stay where they are because there is nowhere else for them to go. Eyes move from darkness to darker shapes below, trying to make sense of ground that offers almost nothing back. The aircraft is lighter now, but it feels more exposed, not less. When the engine is running, there is noise to stand between the body and what is happening. In silence, there is only the aircraft, the air, and the distance still left to cross. You do not think about grandeur. You do not think about history. You think about timing. There is the weight of the machine under you, and the knowledge of how little separates you from the air around it. Fabric, wood, wire, an engine that has been cut on purpose. No armor, no excess. Nothing in the aircraft that can pretend to be stronger than it is. The controls tell the truth through the hands. Every change in the air comes through immediately. Every small correction matters. You do not fly this way because it feels safe. You fly this way because the work requires it. The dark below is not empty. It holds roads, guns, men, positions, the hard lines of a war that is larger than the aircraft passing over it. But from here in the glide, none of that appears in grand scale. It appears in fragments. A faint shape, a seam in the dark, a guess confirmed too late to call certainty. The navigator's task narrows the world. The pilot's task narrows it further. There is no room for unnecessary thought. Only sequence, only movement. Hold course, judge distance, wait, release, pass through. The wind over the wings makes its own sound. It is softer than an engine, but sharper in the mind, because it belongs to a different kind of attention. The aircraft is not charging toward the target. It is arriving by subtraction. Less noise, less speed, less protection, less margin. What remains is precision. In that descent, the whole logic of the method is already present, even before it has been explained. The weakness of the aircraft is there. The exposure is there. The reliance on timing is there. So is the strange advantage that comes from being underestimated, from moving slowly enough to become difficult in a different way, from making silence do work that armor and speed cannot do. Then the release. The aircraft does not become heroic in that moment. It becomes committed. What it carries is let go. The body registers the change before the mind names it. Lighter, past the line, still vulnerable, still low, still needing to live through the next seconds and the next until the engine catches again and the machine returns to noise, vibration, and the thin comfort of motion under power. Only after that does the mind widen enough to understand the shape of what has just happened. This was not brute force. It was not spectacle. It was a method built out of limits and made workable through repetition, discipline, and exact timing. The women who flew these night missions did not enter the war in machines designed to dominate the sky. They entered it in aircraft that looked obsolete beside the faster, heavier, better protected technology that defined modern air warfare. Yet within that disadvantage, they developed a way of operating that was difficult to predict, difficult to counter cleanly, and impossible to dismiss once it began to accumulate. The glide was central to that method. It was practical before it was legendary. Cutting the engine before approach, reduced noise, and altered how the aircraft was perceived from the ground. It transformed a vulnerable biplane into something harder to place within normal expectations of attack. German soldiers later gave the regiment its enduring nickname because of what they heard in those moments, not the roar of a bomber, but the unsettling rush of air through darkness. The legend came later. The method came first. What matters at the opening of this book is not simply that these women flew dangerous missions at night. Many histories can state that much in a sentence. What matters is the structure inside the act. A fragile aircraft, intentionally stripped of the illusion of power, enters darkness and survives through timing. The silence is not incidental atmosphere, it is part of the tactic. The exposure is not rhetorical, it is physical fact. And the mission does not depend on one overwhelming action, so much as on the ability to repeat such actions again and again, under conditions that should have made that repetition impossible. That is the threshold this work begins from. Before the statistics, before the doctrine, before the regiment's redesignation and honours, there is this approach: engine cut, body braced, wind over wings, ground barely visible, the aircraft descending through a darkness that offers neither protection nor explanation. The experience itself contains the argument that the history will go on to make. Effectiveness is not always loud, it is not always armoured, it is not always built from obvious advantage. Sometimes it begins in a machine too fragile for prestige, in a method too narrow for spectacle, and in a silence that does its work before anyone has found the language to name it. The war these women entered favoured speed, payload, and survivability. Their aircraft offered little of any of the three. To understand what the Night Witches became, we have to begin there. With a system that did not seem built for them, and with a mission profile that made sense only because conventional strength was never truly available to them in the first place.
We are told the aircraft is enough. It is not fast, it is not protected, it is not new. When you look at it in daylight, nothing about it asks to be feared. Wood, fabric, wires, a cockpit left open to weather and darkness. Men look at machines like this and decide things before they have seen them in the air. They decide what kind of war belongs to speed and armour and engines with enough power to make their own certainty. We learn early not to think in those terms. The aircraft does not become something else because we need it to. It remains what it is, light, exposed, and honest about its weakness. The cold still comes through. The engine still sounds too loud before it is cut. The ground is still hard. A mistake is still a mistake. Nothing in the machine lies to us about danger. So the lesson is not confidence. The lesson is adjustment. You stop asking the aircraft to be powerful in the ways other aircraft are powerful. You begin asking different things of it. Can it stay low? Can it be guided in darkness? Can it carry enough? Can it return? Can it go again? That is the part people do not see at first. A weak machine forces clear thinking. It strips away fantasy. You do not enter it believing you are protected. You enter it knowing you are exposed, and that anything useful you make of it will have to come from timing, discipline, and the refusal to confuse appearance with effect. The war is larger than you. The machine is smaller than the war. The question is whether there is still a way inside that difference.
These composite entries are grounded in documented recollections and descriptions of the aircraft, exposure, and operational conditions faced by Soviet airwomen. The women, later known as the Night Witches, entered a war that did not appear designed for them. To understand what they became, we have to begin with the system they entered. A war that rewarded size, speed, payload, and survivability, and an aircraft that offered remarkably little of any of them. By the time the Soviet Women's Night Bomber Regiment entered combat, modern air warfare was already defined by a recognizable logic. Aircraft were judged by how fast they could move, how much they could carry, how well they could defend themselves, and how much punishment they could survive. In that framework, strength was visible. It had weight, armor, firepower, and range. The most obvious path to effectiveness seemed to be more of each. That is why the women's later success can be misunderstood if it is told only as inspiration. Their story does not begin with hidden superiority waiting to be discovered. It begins with structural mismatch. The aircraft they flew did not fit the dominant image of wartime air power. Their regiment did not enter the war in the kind of machine that promised dominance from a distance. It entered it in something slower, lighter, and far more exposed than the technologies that usually define aerial combat in the Second World War. This mismatch mattered not only materially, but intellectually. If a system is built around assumptions of speed and force, then anything that cannot compete on those terms is expected either to fail or to remain marginal. The Night Witches emerged inside that expectation. Their significance lies partly in the fact that they did not answer the system by becoming a smaller version of it. They answered it by working differently. Before that difference could be seen, however, their disadvantage had to be real. It was.
Nadezhda Popova was a pilot in the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment and one of the most experienced airwomen in the unit. Over the course of the war, she flew more than 800 combat sorties, a total commonly recorded as 852, operating primarily in night bombing missions against German positions. Her service placed her within the sustained operational cycle that defined the regiment's activity. Repeated low-altitude flights, multiple sorties per night, and continuous exposure to ground fire and environmental conditions. Accounts of her missions emphasise the physical vulnerability of both aircraft and crew. In one instance, she returned from a sortie with dozens of bullet holes in her aircraft and equipment, an indication of how frequently these flights passed within range of enemy defences. Her wartime record reflects both the scale and the continuity of the regiment's operations, in which effectiveness was produced not through single decisive strikes, but through repeated, closely timed missions carried out over extended periods. After the war, Popova remained one of the more publicly visible veterans of the regiment, contributing to later recollections and historical understanding of Soviet airwomen in combat. The regiment did not appear by accident. It was created inside a specific wartime need and within a political context that made women's aviation service possible, in a way that was unusual for the period. Marina Raskova, already a celebrated Soviet aviator, used her public standing and political access to help secure the formation of women's aviation units after the German invasion of the Soviet Union intensified the need for personnel and expanded the scale of the war. The Night Witches were part of that larger decision, not an isolated curiosity. That distinction matters. If the unit is framed only as an anomaly, its existence feels accidental, almost folkloric. If it is framed instead as a wartime formation built inside necessity, ideology, and available skill, then it becomes legible as a serious military response to pressure. The women were still underestimated. They still faced scepticism. But they were not simply wandering into combat against the grain of history. They were entering a structure that had been deliberately opened, even if uneasily, because war had made old assumptions less stable than they appeared. This is one of the reasons Marina Raskova matters so much in the foundations of the story. She is not merely a precursor. She is part of the mechanism by which possibility became policy. Her presence reminds the reader that before these women became known for operational method, there had to be an institutional decision that allowed them to exist as a regiment at all. That decision does not erase later hardship. It clarifies the pathway into it. Marina Raskova was a Soviet aviator whose pre-war achievements established her as one of the most prominent female pilots in the Soviet Union. She gained national recognition following long-distance record flights, including the 1938 Rodina flight, and was among the first women to be awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Her public stature placed her in a position of influence at the outset of the Second World War. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Raskova played a central role in the formation of women's aviation units. Responding to appeals from female pilots seeking combat roles, she petitioned the Soviet leadership and secured authorization for the creation of Aviation Group 122, which included 3 all-female regiments. Among them was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, later redesignated as the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. Raskova's involvement extended beyond advocacy. She participated directly in organising the units and in their initial development as operational formations within the Soviet Air Force. Her death in January 1943, during a flight to the front, occurred while these units were actively engaged in combat operations. Her role links pre-war aviation achievement with wartime mobilisation, marking a transition from individual accomplishment to institutional formation within the Soviet military structure.
The Polikarpov Po-2 is central to the foundations of this story because it embodies the contradiction at the heart of the regiment's story. It was old-fashioned by wartime standards, a light biplane of wood and fabric construction with an open cockpit, limited payload, and little in the way of protection. It looked like exactly the wrong aircraft for a war increasingly defined by power and technological escalation. And yet, the very features that made it appear inadequate also shaped the tactical possibilities the regiment would later exploit. Its slowness and simplicity were liabilities in one frame and advantages in another. Its construction reduced some forms of detectability. Its handling characteristics made it useful for low-speed night operations. Its limitations forced the crews to operate close to the ground, with little margin and no illusions. It did not solve their problems for them. It defined the conditions under which solutions would have to be found. This is why the aircraft belongs in foundations rather than only in method. Before it became part of a tactic, it was already part of the regiment's reality. To enter a Po-2 was to begin from exposure. The cockpit was open to cold and weather. Protection was minimal. Payload was small. None of this is incidental background. It is the starting point of the logic that follows. If the machine had been stronger, in conventional terms, the regiment's method might never have developed the way it did. The weakness was not rhetorical. It was structural, material, and immediate. What emerges across these early conditions is not yet mastery, and it is certainly not triumph. It is a more demanding and more historically credible beginning. A war built around force, a unit formed inside necessity, and an aircraft that exposed its crews to danger without pretending otherwise. The women who entered this system were not entering on favorable terms. That is precisely why the next stage matters. If they could not rely on protection, speed, or technological superiority, then whatever competence they developed had to be learned another way. Their later effectiveness begins here, in disadvantage that remained real, and in the question that disadvantage forced upon them. How do you become capable inside a structure that was not built for your kind of strength? That question leads directly into the next section. If this unit was structurally mismatched to the war it entered, then the real problem was not courage alone, it was formation. How were these women trained, compressed, and adapted into operators who could function within such narrow margins at all?
At first, the darkness does not feel like part of flying. It feels like the absence of everything you were supposed to use. In daylight, distance can still be guessed at. The land gives itself away in shapes and edges. At night, the ground is less a surface than a suspicion. You learn to look differently because looking the old way stops helping. What matters is not whether the aircraft feels ready. It is whether your hands learn what to do before doubt has time to settle in. Nothing arrives one piece at a time. There is no long season of comfort before the demands become real. The war presses against the training from the beginning. The aircraft is still the same aircraft. The cold still comes through the cockpit. The engine still has its own moods. The maps do not become easier because you want them to. You are given instruction, correction, more instruction, and the knowledge that all of it must become usable quickly. There are things you stop asking for. Better weather, better protection, more time. You stop waiting for the conditions to improve and begin learning how to think inside them as they are. The machine cannot be made into a different machine. The night cannot be asked to reveal more than it will reveal. So the work becomes narrower and sharper. Hold the line, judge the distance, learn the sound of the engine, learn the feel of the controls when the aircraft is light and when it is loaded. Learn what the dark hides and what it does not. No one becomes capable here by accident. Skill is built under pressure, and pressure leaves very little room for fantasy. The women who entered these regiments did not move from civilian life into combat readiness by way of long preparation or protected apprenticeship. Their formation was compressed by war. To understand the Night Witch's later effectiveness, it is necessary to understand the speed and severity of that transition.
The women who entered these regiments did not move from civilian life into combat readiness by way of long preparation or protected apprenticeship. Their formation was compressed by war. To understand the Night Witch's later effectiveness, it is necessary to understand the speed and severity of that transition. The women who became known as the Night Witches entered military aviation through a wartime structure that was both exceptional and urgent. Their entry into combat roles followed the creation of women's aviation regiments under Marina Raskova's influence, but the existence of those units did not lessen the pressures placed upon the women inside them. Once formed, the regiments had to turn enthusiasm, prior flying experience, and political opportunity into operational capability at a pace determined not by ideal training conditions, but by the demands of an ongoing war. This compressed transition matters because it changes the listener's sense of what competence meant in this context. These women were not moving into a stable training environment with generous margins for gradual development. They were being drawn into a system in which time was limited, expectations were high, and the consequences of insufficiency were immediate. Some entered with prior aviation backgrounds, others arrived with less practical depth than wartime operations would soon require. What united them was not uniform readiness, but the fact that readiness had to be produced quickly and under pressure. That pressure shaped both skill and mentality. Training in this context was not merely the acquisition of technical procedures, it was the narrowing of attention toward what could actually be controlled. Navigation, aircraft handling, communication, approach discipline, response to poor visibility, and the physical endurance required for repeated flight all had to move from instruction into habit. In conventional telling, wartime training can easily become montage, determination, practice, competence. In this case, that would flatten the reality. The speed of the transition was itself part of the story. These women were not given the luxury of becoming pilots in abstraction. They were becoming operators for a specific kind of work inside a war already underway. That is one reason the regiment's later discipline should not be treated as a natural extension of courage alone. Courage may help someone volunteer. It does not teach night navigation. It does not produce timing. It does not create the kind of consistency necessary for repeated sorties in fragile aircraft. Those capacities had to be built, corrected, and reinforced. The fact that they were built under wartime compression is part of what gives the regiment's later record its weight. Training alone did not define what these women were becoming. Just as important was the fact that they were learning inside limitation from the outset. The constraints described in the previous section did not wait until combat to become relevant. They were already present in the work of becoming capable. Minimal instrumentation, night conditions, exposure to weather, and the handling realities of the Po-2 shaped the learning environment itself. This meant that adaptation was not a later refinement layered on top of stable competence. Adaptation was part of competence from the beginning. To learn to fly under these conditions was to learn that information would often be incomplete, that visibility would be poor, that the aircraft would not compensate for error, and that the environment would not simplify itself for the sake of training. The women were being prepared not for ideal execution, but for function within narrow margins. That distinction clarifies much about the regiment's later method. Their tactics would eventually be described in terms of ingenuity, silence, and repeated pressure, but those qualities were inseparable from the conditions in which their operational thinking developed. They were not trained first in abundance and later deprived of it. They were shaped by scarcity and exposure from the beginning. In that sense, the learning environment and the combat environment were linked. The habits that mattered later were the habits formed when equipment was limited, the night was difficult, and precision had to be learned without waiting for confidence to arrive first. This is also where the moral tone of the book matters. It would be easy to romanticize this process into a story of toughness proven through hardship. That is not quite right. Hardship alone proves nothing. What matters is what was built within it. The training of these women was significant because it produced functional adaptation under severe constraints, not because suffering itself carried meaning. Their later combat effectiveness came from the disciplined conversion of pressure into method. By the end of this phase, the essential shift had begun. These women were no longer simply aspiring pilots or patriotic volunteers entering a new wartime category. They were becoming a unit whose members understood that survival and usefulness would depend on mastering a specific relationship between fragility and precision. The aircraft would not become stronger. The night would not become clearer. Time would not become more generous. What could change was their ability to think and act inside those fixed conditions with increasing exactness. That is the threshold at which this section closes. The women have entered the system and begun to be shaped by it. They have not yet demonstrated the full form of their method, but the conditions that will make that method necessary are now in place. The next step is no longer formation alone. It is operation. Once trained under constraint, what exactly did they do? And how did that pattern of action become effective enough to matter?
We do not think about winning when we approach. We think about arriving. The engine carries us as long as it must. There is a point where it becomes too loud, too present, too easy to find. You learn that distance is not only measured in kilometres, it is measured in sound, in how far that sound travels before it becomes warning. The signal comes without speaking. It is already understood. The hand moves, the engine cuts. The silence is not complete. It never is. The wires hum. The wind presses against the wings and moves along the struts. The aircraft changes its feeling in the air. Without the engine, it is lighter and less certain at the same time. You listen differently when there is no motor to cover the smaller sounds. The ground is still not visible in a way that can be trusted, but it is closer now. You feel it before you see it. There is a narrow space where everything has to be held at once. Height, distance, direction, timing. Too early and the bombs fall short. Too late and you carry them past the point where you should have released them. There is no correction that comes without consequence. You do not have speed to recover from error. You do not have protection if you are seen. The release is not dramatic, it is mechanical. A movement learned enough times that it no longer feels like a question. The aircraft shifts again when the weight leaves. That change is immediate and clear. The ground answers a moment later, but by then you are already moving away. The engine must come back. It does not always want to. Your hands know the sequence. The sound returns, and with it the feeling that you have re-entered the air as something visible again. We do not stay, we turn. There will be another approach.
The method they used did not depend on overpowering the enemy. It depended on controlling approach, timing, and exposure, with a precision shaped by the limits of their aircraft. The operational method of the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment can only be understood clearly when set against the dominant assumptions of Second World War air warfare. Across most theatres, effectiveness in the air was associated with speed, payload, altitude, and survivability. Aircraft were designed to reach targets quickly, deliver large quantities of ordnance, and either absorb damage or avoid it through maneuver and protection. Within that framework, advantage was measured in power and scale. The regiment did not possess those advantages. The Polikarpov Po-2 was slow, lightly constructed, and minimally protected. It could not outrun enemy fighters, could not carry heavy bomb loads, and offered little defense against concentrated fire. To operate within the dominant model would have meant operating at a constant disadvantage with no compensating strength. What emerges across multiple accounts is not an attempt to overcome this imbalance through incremental improvement, but a shift away from the model itself. The regiment's effectiveness did not come from competing within a system that favored speed and mass. It came from adopting a method that reduced the importance of those factors. This shift is central. The Night Witches did not win by doing the same thing less effectively. They operated by changing what counted as effectiveness. Once the need for a different approach is established, the structure of that approach becomes clearer. The regiment operated primarily at night, at low altitude, and with a high degree of manual control. These choices were not stylistic. They were dictated by both limitation and opportunity. Night operations reduced visibility and made interception more difficult, but they also placed heavy demands on navigation and coordination. The aircraft's minimal instrumentation meant that pilots relied on maps, landmarks, and experience rather than advanced navigational aids. The environment was uncertain, and that uncertainty had to be managed through attention rather than equipment. Low-altitude flight further shaped the method. Flying closer to the ground reduced exposure to certain forms of detection and interception, but it increased the risk associated with terrain, obstacles, and limited reaction time. It also narrowed the margin for error during approach and release. The aircraft could not rely on altitude as a buffer. Precision became more important because there was less space in which to correct mistakes. Within this framework, the approach to a target was not a single action, but a sequence of controlled decisions. Distance, angle, speed, and timing had to be coordinated without the support systems available to more advanced aircraft. The method demanded attention rather than automation. It required the pilot and navigator to maintain a shared understanding of position and timing under conditions that did not simplify themselves. The most distinctive element of this method, the engine cut and glide, emerges directly from these conditions. As the aircraft approached its target, the engine would be reduced or shut off entirely, allowing the plane to glide silently toward the release point. This maneuver removed the most obvious indicator of the aircraft's presence, its sound. The effect of this change was not absolute invisibility. The aircraft could still be seen or heard under certain conditions. What it did was alter the timing of detection. Without the engine, the aircraft became more difficult to locate until it was already close to its target. By the time sound or movement was registered, the window for effective response was reduced. This technique also reflects the relationship between fragility and precision. The Po-2's slow speed and simple construction made it vulnerable, but those same characteristics allowed it to fly in ways that faster, heavier aircraft could not easily replicate. The glide was not an improvisation added to an otherwise standard method. It was a direct use of the aircraft's limitations as a tactical feature. The release itself was simple in mechanical terms, but it occurred within a tightly constrained window. The aircraft had to be positioned correctly in space and time, with limited ability to adjust once the glide began. After release, the engine would be restarted, and the aircraft would leave the target area to prepare for the next sortie. At the level of the individual aircraft, this method depended on coordination between a two-person crew. One member flew the aircraft, maintaining control under low visibility and managing the approach. The other handled navigation, and in many cases the preparation and release of bombs. These roles were distinct but interdependent. The success of the approach relied on both members maintaining awareness of position, timing, and sequence. The physical demands of this work were constant. Open cockpits exposed crews to cold and wind. Communication had to occur under conditions where speech could be difficult. The repetition of sorties meant that fatigue was not an occasional factor, but a sustained condition. Within this environment, the method had to be repeatable. It could not depend on exceptional moments of clarity or isolated acts of precision. It had to function reliably across multiple flights, often within a single night. This is where the regiment's operational discipline becomes most visible. The method was not defined by a single maneuver, but by the consistency with which a sequence of actions could be performed under pressure. Each sortie required the same alignment of approach, glide, release, and withdrawal. The effectiveness of the unit depended on how consistently that sequence could be executed, not on how dramatically it could be performed.
Yevdokia Bershanskaya was the commander of the regiment initially formed as the 588th Night Bomber Regiment and later redesignated the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. A trained pilot with extensive pre-war aviation experience, she graduated from the Bataysk School of Pilots and served as an instructor before assuming command responsibilities. In 1941, following the creation of women's aviation units under Marina Raskova, Bershanskaya was selected to lead the Night Bomber Regiment, a position she held for the duration of the war. Her tenure was marked by continuity of command during sustained combat operations. Under her leadership, the regiment remained intact as an all-female unit from its formation through its later Guards designation and eventual disbandment in 1945. Over the course of the war, the regiment flew more than 23,000 sorties. 23 of its aviators were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, reflecting the cumulative recognition of the unit's operational record. Bershanskaya was awarded the Order of Suvorov, making her the only woman to receive this decoration. Her command was associated with the consistent organization of training, coordination of repeated night operations, and maintenance of operational discipline under conditions defined by limited equipment and continuous exposure. The regiment was informally referred to as the Duncan Regiment, a name derived from her nickname, indicating the close identification between her leadership and the unit's internal cohesion.
By the end of this section, the method is clear in its structure. It is defined by controlled approach, limited visibility, coordinated execution, and a deliberate use of the aircraft's constraints. It is also inherently small in scale. Each individual sortie carries a limited payload and produces a limited immediate effect. What remains is to understand how such a method, repeated under these conditions, could accumulate into something that mattered beyond the level of a single flight.
By the third flight, the night has changed shape. Not outside. Outside it is still dark, still cold, still broken only by the same scattered lights and the same hard patches of earth below. The change is in the body. The first sortie belongs to concentration. The second belongs to return. By the third, the work has become rhythm. Land, climb down, speak only what must be said. The aircraft is touched, checked, loaded again. Hands move over surfaces that are already cold and then colder. Someone passes the next instruction. Someone points. Someone has already moved ahead of you to the next necessary thing. There is no room in it for grandeur. The body is tired, but the sequence is stronger than the tiredness. It carries you forward. You stop dividing the night into separate missions. It begins to feel like one long motion broken into turns. Out, in, out again. Noise, silence, release, return. The same route does not feel the same when repeated. It grows narrower. What was once an event becomes a pattern. What was once fear becomes timing. You still know the danger. You do not forget it. But the mind stops widening around it. It contracts toward usefulness. The exhaustion is not dramatic. It is practical. Hands that must still stay precise. Eyes that must still judge distance. A body that has already done the work and is asked to do it again. There is no special language for that in the moment. Only the knowledge that another aircraft has landed, another has gone up, and yours will do the same. The bomb load is small. No single flight feels large enough to explain itself. but the night is not asking to be explained one flight at a time.
The method used by the night witches mattered not only because it could be executed once, but because it could be repeated. Its significance lies in accumulation. To understand that, the focus has to widen from the individual sortie to the rhythm of many. One of the easiest ways to misunderstand the night witches is to look for their significance in the scale of a single attack. By that measure, their aircraft appear limited, almost to the point of insignificance. The Po-2 could not carry the heavy bomb loads associated with larger bombers. Each individual run delivered relatively little destructive force. A single sortie, taken alone, did not resemble the kind of overwhelming strike that conventional military narratives often privilege. That is precisely why the regiment's pattern of operations matters so much. Their method was not designed around decisive singular events. It was built around recurrence. Each mission was small in immediate scale but structured to be performed again and again across a night, and then again across the next night and the next after that. The meaning of any one sortie therefore lies less in its isolated effect than in its place within a chain. This is where the regiment's method becomes harder to classify within familiar categories of force. It did not seek to alter a battlefield by magnitude at a single point in time. It sought to create pressure through return. A small payload, repeated frequently enough and delivered with enough consistency, ceases to function as a minor event. It becomes a condition. The distinction is crucial. Many military systems are designed to interpret threat in terms of scale: large attacks, large losses, large visible consequences. The night witches imposed themselves through another logic. Their operations were cumulative rather than singular. To understand them clearly, the reader must stop asking what one sortie could do and begin asking what dozens, hundreds, and eventually thousands of such sorties could become. The lived structure of that accumulation was the flight cycle itself. Accounts of the regiment repeatedly return to the same pattern: prepare, depart, approach, release, withdraw, land, refuel, reload, and go again. This rhythm matters not only as background detail, but as the actual operational engine of the unit. A night of combat for the regiment was not defined by one mission, but by rotation. Crews might fly several sorties in a single night, and under some conditions, the number could rise dramatically. The aircraft's limited payload meant it had to return often. Its simplicity meant it could be turned around quickly enough to make such repetition viable. What appeared at first as weakness, small capacity, light construction, narrow tactical scope, also enabled a pace of recurrence that more heavily built aircraft could not reproduce in the same way. This rhythm shaped the meaning of labor inside the regiment. Flying was only one part of the cycle. Landing did not bring closure. It brought a compressed interval in which the aircraft had to be prepared for departure again, the crew reset, the next target assigned or confirmed, and the whole sequence begun anew. The pattern was operational before it was symbolic. It governed bodies, machines, and time. That is why repetition here should not be treated as mere persistence. It was structured persistence. The women were not simply enduring one hard night after another. They were participating in a system that transformed limitation into frequency. The smallness of the aircraft's bomb load and the shortness of the turnaround were not separate facts. They belonged to the same logic. One created the need to return, the other made return possible. Once the pattern is seen clearly, the importance of sortie density comes into view. The regiment flew thousands of missions over the course of the war, and the cumulative scale of those operations is one of the clearest indicators that their method was not incidental. More than 23,000 sorties were eventually credited to the unit. Such a number does not merely confirm activity, it confirms that repetition itself was the core of their operational identity. Sortie density matters because it changes the scale at which force is understood. A single lightly armed biplane may seem marginal within a war dominated by larger machines. A regiment flying those machines repeatedly, night after night, becomes something else. The measure of effect shifts from the weight carried in one aircraft to the pressure sustained by many returns over time. This is also where the regiment's method begins to escape the intuition of conventional comparison. If judged only against the destructive potential of heavier bombers, the Po-2 remains obviously limited. But if judged according to the regiment's actual pattern of use, high recurrence, disciplined timing, repeated presence, its role appears differently. The aircraft was not being asked to be something it was not. It was being used according to a pattern that made its limitations part of a larger operational design. Sortie density is therefore not a numerical flourish. It is evidence that the method held. These women were not improvising an occasional workaround. They were sustaining a repeated form of attack across enough time and with enough regularity to become strategically legible.
Irina Sabrova was one of the most active navigators in the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, and among the women most closely associated with the sheer density of its wartime operations. Over the course of the war, she flew more than 1,000 combat sorties, a total commonly recorded as 1,008, more than any other member of the regiment. Her service record reflects the repeated rhythm of night bombing as it was actually lived. Repeated departures, repeated approaches, repeated returns, and the accumulation of effect through frequency rather than spectacle. As a navigator, Sabrova occupied one of the most exacting positions in the aircraft's working structure. The regiment's methods depended not only on endurance, but on precise judgment of route, timing, and release point under conditions of darkness, limited instrumentation, and continuous exposure. By October 1944, she had already completed 825 combat sorties, and her nomination for Hero of the Soviet Union cited the scale and consistency of that record. She was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union on February 23, 1945. By the end of the war, her 1,008 sorties had made her the highest mission airwoman in the regiment. Her wartime record reflects the operational scale that underlay the Night Witch's reputation. Not a small number of exceptional missions, but a sustained pattern of work carried out until repetition itself became force.
The deeper significance of this pattern lies in what it did to time. The Night Witches did not merely attack positions. They interrupted intervals. Their recurrence altered the enemy's relationship to rest, anticipation, and recovery. The next attack could not be understood as a separate future event if it arrived before the previous disruption had fully settled. This temporal pressure is one of the clearest ways to understand how repetition became force. In many kinds of warfare, destruction is measured spatially. How much damage, how many positions hit, how much ground altered. The Night Witches certainly inflicted physical damage, but the distinctive quality of their method lay in how it occupied time. Each return denied closure. Each renewed approach shortened the distance between one attack and the expectation of another. This made their presence difficult to dismiss, even when the material effect of a single sortie was limited. A pattern of repeated attacks forces an opponent to remain alert longer, to respond more often, and to live within a heightened uncertainty about when the next disruption will come. It is here that recurrence begins to function as pressure rather than mere repetition. Frequency changes not only the quantity of actions, but the conditions under which those actions are experienced. The regiment's pattern was therefore strategic in a way that is easy to miss if one looks only at isolated results. Their aircraft were small, their payloads were limited, and their individual sorties were brief. Yet taken together, those flights imposed a recurring strain that could not be understood through singular events alone. They made themselves felt through return. What emerges from this section is a clearer understanding of how the Night Witches converted limitation into a working form of force. Their aircraft did not become larger. Their attacks did not become singularly decisive. Their method remained narrow, exposed, and modest in immediate scale. But by being repeated often enough, and with enough discipline, it began to produce something larger than the individual mission could explain. This is one of the central patterns of the book. Constraint did not disappear. It was organized. Fragility did not vanish. It was worked around through timing and recurrence. The regiment did not overcome weakness by ceasing to be weak. It overcame weakness by refusing to treat the individual sortie as the only meaningful unit of action. That is why repetition must be understood here not as background persistence, but as operational design. It is the structure that allowed a light biplane and a small bomb load to register across the larger scale of war. Once repetition is understood as force, the next question widens naturally beyond the crews themselves. If this pattern mattered, not because of any one attack, but because of what repeated attacks did over time, then the focus must shift outward. What did this rhythm of return do to the enemy system ask to absorb it?
You do not see the whole effect from the air. You see the target area, or what can be made of it, in the dark. You see where the bombs go, or where you think they go. You hear fire sometimes, and sometimes nothing at all. Then you turn back. The night folds behind you, and whatever happened below belongs to the ground again. What returns more clearly than the sight of impact is the return itself. We come once, then again after that. By the time the body begins to count in effort instead of numbers, the meaning of the work has shifted. The flight is no longer only about what one bomb can do or what one aircraft can reach. It is about what happens when the same interruption refuses to remain singular. The ground cannot know when it hears one aircraft approach, whether it is hearing one mission or the beginning of many. That uncertainty is part of the work. It changes how the dark is inhabited. It changes how waiting feels. A position under repeated approach is not only struck, it is made restless. We do not stay long enough to witness the whole consequence. The aircraft is too exposed for that. We arrive, release, leave, return, and leave again. The shape of the effect has to be understood afterward, from the pattern, not from the single pass. There is a point in the night when the work stops feeling separate. The sorties join each other. The sound of the engine cutting becomes part of something larger than one crew and one aircraft. You can feel that from inside the repetition, even if you cannot yet name it. The enemy is not being asked to survive one attack. The enemy is being asked to absorb the knowledge that another may come before the last one has settled.
The Night Witches' significance did not rest solely in the physical damage of individual sorties. Their method mattered because repeated attack altered the larger conditions under which the enemy had to function. At the level of a single sortie, the regiment's physical destructive power was limited. The Po-2 could carry only a small bomb load, and each individual aircraft delivered relatively modest material effect compared with larger bombers. If the Night Witches are judged only by the scale of visible destruction produced by one pass, they risk appearing peripheral to the wider air war. That measure is too narrow for what their operations actually did. Their impact extended beyond direct physical damage because their method imposed recurring disruption on systems built to depend on intervals of predictability, rest, and orderly response. They did destroy equipment, damage positions, and hit logistical targets. But the distinctive quality of their operations lay in the disproportion between the smallness of each immediate action and the broader instability that repeated actions created over time. This is where the logic of repetition becomes fully legible. A bombing campaign need not produce maximum destruction per sortie to be militarily meaningful. It can also alter the conditions under which the enemy is forced to live, move, and remain alert. The Night Witches' operations did exactly that. Their attacks stretched attention, disturbed sleep, interrupted routine, and denied a clean sense of closure after any one sortie. The battlefield significance of the regiment therefore cannot be reduced to blast radius or bomb weight alone. Their effect was temporal as much as material. This distinction matters because it clarifies why a regiment flying fragile, lightly armed aircraft could still become strategically consequential. They were not simply delivering small quantities of force. They were changing the terms under which force was experienced. The enemy was not passive in the face of these attacks. Anti-aircraft defenses responded. Searchlights, ground fire, and night fighter efforts all formed part of the environment through which the night witches had to pass. Yet the regiment's operational method made clean adaptation difficult. Part of the difficulty lay in mismatch. Defensive systems are often optimized against recognizable kinds of threat. Aircraft moving at expected speeds, arriving within more legible profiles, and presenting clearer windows for interception. The Po-2 complicated those expectations. Its slowness, low-altitude approach, and engine-cut glide altered timing and perception in ways that made response more difficult to synchronize. What might seem, in abstract comparison, to be a technological weakness became here a tactical complication for the defender. This is not the same as saying the aircraft were invulnerable. They were not. The women were exposed to fire, losses occurred, and the regiment paid heavily for every sustained season of combat. But vulnerability and difficulty of interception can coexist. That coexistence is one of the central paradoxes of the night witches method. The aircraft were easy to destroy once effectively targeted, yet not always easy to target on the terms defensive systems preferred. The deeper problem for the enemy was not only interception in the immediate sense, but adjustment at the level of routine. Repeated attacks forced anti-aircraft crews and nearby forces into extended readiness. A threat that returns irregularly but frequently enough erodes the distinction between active defense and anticipated defense. This is how a limited tactical action begins to scale upward. Each individual sortie may be brief, but each one contributes to a wider failure of stable adaptation. The regiment did not have to render enemy defenses useless in order to matter. It was enough to keep those defenses strained, reactive, and unable to settle comfortably into a clean rhythm of response. The German nickname Night Witches belongs in this section because it reveals something important about how the regiment was perceived from the outside. The name did not arise from a neutral technical description. It arose from the sensory and psychological effect of the attacks as they were experienced by those on the receiving end. The most commonly repeated explanation points to the sound made during the final approach, not the steady engine noise expected of an aircraft, but the rushing, whispering quality of the glide after the motor had been cut. That altered sound profile mattered because it did not announce itself in ordinary terms. It arrived late, ambiguously, and close. The nickname emerged from perception before it hardened into legend. What the name captures, in compressed form, is the gap between material modesty and experiential impact. A small, slow, lightly armed aircraft should not, in conventional logic, generate an aura large enough to produce such a name. Yet it did. The reason is not mystical. It is structural. Repeated, poorly timed to defense, acoustically unusual approaches in darkness create a different psychological signature than daylight bombardment by heavier machines. The nickname records that signature. At the same time, the name can mislead if it is allowed to substitute for explanation. It risks turning a regiment with a disciplined operational method into a creature of folklore. The task of this section is not to discard the nickname, but to place it properly. The legend reflects a real effect. It does not explain the effect on its own. What lay beneath it was a repeated pattern of small attacks, altered perception, strained response, and denied rest. Seen at this scale, the Night Witches' operations become easier to understand in system terms. Their aircraft did not dominate airspace. Their bomb loads did not redefine destruction. Their tactic did something narrower and, in its own way, more corrosive. It entered the enemy's time, attention, and expectation. It made the night unreliable. That unreliability is one of the clearest forms of system-level impact available to a lightly equipped regiment. It does not depend on spectacular force. It depends on repetition becoming a condition. Once that happens, each new sortie carries with it more than its own immediate material effect. It carries the accumulated memory of previous return. This is why the regiment's impact cannot be measured only in targets struck or bombs dropped. Those quantities matter, and later sections will return to them. But here the emphasis has to remain on a wider pattern. The Night Witches changed how their enemy occupied darkness. They altered rest, response, and expectation. They made the battlefield feel less settled than the scale of their aircraft should have allowed. That, in turn, reveals a broader military principle, already visible elsewhere in the book. Effect is not always proportional to the size of the instrument that produces it. Under some conditions, persistence, timing, and sensory disruption reshape a system more effectively than a larger but less recurring force. If this section has widened the frame properly, the next movement becomes unavoidable. The Night Witches imposed pressure outward on the enemy system asked to absorb their repeated return. But that pressure was not produced without cost. Every sortie that strained the enemy also demanded something from the women who flew it, from the aircraft that carried them, and from the bodies required to repeat the same exposed method through cold, fatigue, danger, and loss.
The cold arrives before the aircraft does. It is there when we walk out to the field. It is in the metal before a hand closes over it, and in the boards beneath our boots. By the time the engine starts, the cold has already entered everything that will have to move. It settles into the fingers first, then the face, then anywhere the wind can find a seam and keep it. There are nights when the body feels less like a body than a collection of small tasks. Fasten this. Hold that. Watch the wire. Read the dark. Do not let the hand stiffen on the control. Do not let the eyes settle too long in one place. There is no advantage in thinking too far ahead. The next approach is enough. The next return is enough. After that, there will be another. The aircraft does not protect you from the weather so much as carry you through it. The cockpit is open. The wind does not stop because you are flying for your life. It strikes the face and hands with the same indifference each time. By the end of a night, the body begins to feel reduced to its useful parts. Vision, grip, balance, judgment. Anything beyond that can wait. What cannot wait is the turn back toward the target, and then the next one after that. The danger does not become abstract because it is repeated. If anything, repetition sharpens its ordinary shape. Fire from below. Darkness that hides as much as it guides. An engine that must start again. A machine that will burn quickly if it is hit well enough. The work teaches you not to dramatize these things because drama wastes strength. It teaches you to live beside them instead. Then someone does not return. There is no language large enough for that in the moment. The aircraft land, or they do not. Names continue in the mind longer than they can continue on the field. The work does not pause because grief would prefer it to. The next flight waits with the same indifference as the cold.
The Night Witches' method imposed strain on the enemy, but it was built from a strain equally real on the side of those who carried it out. The cost of the regiment's operations was physical, mechanical, and human, and none of those can be separated cleanly from the effectiveness of the method itself. The regiment's method has to be understood within the conditions in which it was actually performed. The most immediate of those conditions was exposure. The Po-2's open cockpit placed crews directly into the elements, and night operations intensified that exposure. Cold, wind, darkness, and fatigue were not secondary difficulties added to the work from the outside. They were part of the work's normal structure. This matters because the regiment's operations depended on precision, and precision is not produced more easily under such conditions. Flying low at night in minimal protection required constant sensory control. Hands responsive enough to manage the aircraft, eyes able to judge what little could be seen, and attention steady enough to hold sequence under discomfort that was neither brief nor incidental. The weather did not merely make the work unpleasant, it narrowed the margin within which the work could still be done well. Winter conditions made this especially severe. Accounts from Soviet airwomen repeatedly emphasized the physical strain of cold in open aircraft, where crews faced freezing air at altitude with limited protection. This is one of the clearest reminders that the regiment's celebrated method was not only tactically demanding, but bodily expensive. The aircraft could glide quietly, return frequently, and strike with precision, but each of those qualities had to be sustained through bodies operating under persistent environmental punishment. That punishment also accumulated. A single flight in harsh conditions is one thing. A sequence of sorties over the course of a long night is another. Repetition magnified not only operational effect, but physical cost. The same cycle that made the regiment strategically disruptive also ensured that exposure was endured again and again within short intervals. The cold therefore belongs to the method not as background scenery, but as a structuring reality. The aircraft itself embodied another layer of cost. The Po-2 made the regiment's method possible, but it did so without offering meaningful protection. Its light construction, limited speed, and basic design created tactical opportunity in some respects, yet they also meant that crews flew in machines with very little capacity to absorb damage. If the aircraft worked, it worked through narrow success. When it failed, it often failed decisively. This is one of the central paradoxes of the regiment's history. The same characteristics that made the aircraft difficult to intercept cleanly also made it fragile once hit. Slow speed, wood and fabric construction, and minimal armor were not compensating strengths hidden beneath apparent weakness. They were real liabilities, even where they enabled tactical adaptation. The method did not eliminate those liabilities, it merely worked within them. The absence of parachutes on many missions, usually explained as a consequence of weight constraints and operational necessity, sharpens this picture further. Whether in every case or in particular conditions, the broader truth remains: survivability was severely limited. Crews could not assume that equipment failure, enemy fire, or navigational error would be buffered by robust safety measures. The aircraft did not offer much in reserve. This structural fragility is important to keep in view because the regiment's success can otherwise be romanticized into seeming weightless. It was not. The Night Witch's operations were effective precisely because they were carried out in machines that left little room for complacency. Precision mattered because vulnerability was constant. The method was not merely clever, it was necessary. The most serious cost, however, was not cold or exposure, or even the fragility of the aircraft in abstract terms. It was loss. Crews were killed, aircraft were lost, command figures died. The regiment's history is inseparable from the fact that repeated night operations under hostile conditions inevitably carried forward into human absence. This section requires restraint because the danger of overstatement is real. The women do not need to be surrounded with theatrical suffering to be recognized as having endured it. The record is enough. Combat sorties flown under these conditions produced casualties, and those casualties did not occur at a symbolic distance from the daily work. They occurred within the same operational rhythm already described elsewhere in the book. A sortie ended in return, or it did not. The next mission was prepared regardless. That continuity after loss is one of the most difficult facts in the history of the regiment. It reveals both the discipline of the unit and the impersonal pressure of war. The women were not allowed the luxury of treating loss as an interruption that reset the system around it. The system absorbed loss and continued. That continuation is not a sign that loss mattered less. It is evidence of how relentless the operational pattern had become. Marina Raskova's death in 1943 stands as one of the most visible examples, but the broader truth extends beyond a single name. The regiment's method demanded repeated exposure over time, and repeated exposure guarantees that absence will eventually enter the structure. This is why the cost section cannot be treated as a sentimental, aside from the book's operational argument. Loss was not outside the method. It was one of the prices by which the method was sustained.
Raisa Aronova was a pilot in the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment and one of the airwomen whose wartime record makes visible the endurance required by sustained night operations. Over the course of the war, she flew hundreds of combat sorties, participating in the regiment's repeated cycle of low-altitude night bombing against German positions. Her service places her within the operational pattern that defined the unit. Repeated takeoff, approach, release, return, and renewed departure under conditions of darkness, exposure, and constant risk. Aronova's record also reflects the fact that service in the regiment did not unfold without interruption or injury. She was wounded in combat and later returned to flying, continuing her work despite the physical consequences of wartime service and deaths. That return is central to the meaning of her record. The strain borne by the night witches was not abstract, and the continuity of the regiment depended in part on women who resumed operations after the war had already marked them directly. She was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, one of the Soviet Union's highest distinctions for wartime service. Her later life and published recollections contributed to the preserved record of Soviet women in combat aviation. Aronova's service reflects a central fact of the regiment's history. Its operational method endured not because it was safe or forgiving, but because women continued to carry it forward under conditions that remained physically demanding and materially unforgiving.
Taken together, these costs clarify something essential about the regiment's effectiveness. The night witches were not operating from a position of protected ingenuity. Their method did not arise in comfort and then travel outward into risk. It was formed within risk from the beginning. Environmental exposure, fragile equipment, and recurrent loss were not deviations from the regiment's normal state. They were part of the terrain in which normality had to be built. This is why the book's central argument about constraint cannot be reduced to inspiration. The women did not triumph over adversity in the loose narrative sense that later retellings sometimes prefer. They learned how to operate in a system that never ceased asking for more than it gave back. Their effectiveness is therefore inseparable from cost, because the very conditions that forced adaptation also continued to exact payment from those who adapted. In that sense, the regiment's history offers a harder and more disciplined form of admiration. It asks the reader to recognize that a method can be both successful and punishing, both elegant in design and brutal in maintenance. One does not cancel the other. The more clearly the method is understood, the more clearly the burden of sustaining it comes into view. By this point, the pressure of the question has changed. The cost is visible now, cold borne repeatedly, fragile aircraft flown without illusion, absences carried forward because the work continued whether grief had finished with them or not. The next section therefore has to ask what such sustained cost produced in terms the historical record can verify. If the method demanded this much, what did it finally yield?
By the time the papers came through, the work had already passed through our hands so many times it no longer felt separate from the body. The engine note, the cold in the face, the map in the dark, the turn toward the target, the weight gone from the racks, the climb back into black air, none of it needed ceremony. We knew the sequence before we spoke it. We knew the field by its lights, and sometimes by the lack of them. We knew the weight on the ground while the aircraft was turned, checked, loaded again. We knew that the night was measured not once, but in returns. What stays with me is not one mission, it is the accumulation, the way one flight passed into the next until the count itself seemed to belong to someone else. We did not feel large inside it. We felt busy, necessary, tired in ways that became ordinary. Some nights the aircraft came back cut and marked. Some nights they did not all come back at once. Still, the work went on, because the work had to go on, and because stopping would not have changed what the war required. When people later tried to speak of honours, they spoke in totals, in designations, in names written formally. Those things mattered, but they came after the method had already proven itself in the only way war recognises at first, by continuing, by returning, by being able to do it again.
What had been experienced inside the regiment as repeated work was eventually recorded outside it as measurable achievement. By the later years of the war, the Night Witch's effectiveness was no longer merely felt by crews or feared by those below. It had become legible in the historical record. The validation of the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment did not arrive through a single celebrated strike or a dramatic reversal of battlefield doctrine. It emerged instead through accumulation. The same qualities that had initially made the regiment look improbable, light aircraft, small payloads, night operations, exposed crews, were the qualities through which it built a sustained and documentable record of combat service. By the time that record could be seen clearly, the question was no longer whether such a unit could function inside modern war. The question had become how a unit built under such limitations had managed to produce results at such scale. Those results were measurable. Across the war, the regiment flew tens of thousands of combat sorties, most commonly recorded at more than 23,000. The number matters not simply because it is large, but because it confirms the operational logic established earlier in the book. The regiment's effectiveness did not depend on occasional excellence. It depended on recurrence maintained over time. Mission totals, hours flown, bombs delivered, and the duration of frontline service all show the same thing. The method held. It held not for a week, not for a brief symbolic phase, but across years of war under changing conditions. This matters because wartime recognition systems are often more conservative than retrospective memory. Armies do not generally validate units on sentiment alone. They validate what proves useful, durable, and operationally reliable. In that sense, the regiment's redesignation as the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment was more than an honorific flourish. Guard status in the Soviet system signaled proven combat value. It marked the unit as one that had not merely participated, but distinguished itself under fire. The recognition did not erase the fragility of the aircraft or the hardship of the crews. It confirmed that those limitations had not prevented the regiment from becoming militarily significant. The same is true of individual decorations. Multiple members of the regiment received the title Hero of the Soviet Union, among the highest distinctions available. Those awards should not be read as decorative additions to an already romantic story. They are part of the documentary record that shows how the Soviet state itself interpreted the regiment's performance. However uneven later memory might become, wartime recognition makes one point difficult to evade. The Night Witches were not regarded within their own military context as peripheral curiosities. They were regarded as an effective combat formation. What is especially striking is that this validation did not alter the basic nature of their work. Recognition came, but the method remained the same. The regiment did not become important by ceasing to be what it was. It did not exchange repetition for spectacle or fragility for invulnerability. Its record was built by continuing the same pattern of labor that had defined it from the beginning: night approach, release, return, refuel, rearm, and flight again. That continuity matters because it prevents the meaning of success from being misunderstood. Validation did not arrive because the women stopped being constrained. It arrived because they demonstrated, over time and in recordable ways, what disciplined adaptation inside constraint could achieve. There is also a structural point here. By this stage in the book, the reader has already seen how the regiment learned, how it operated, what it imposed on the enemy, and what it cost to sustain. Outcome must therefore do more than repeat that the unit was brave or unusual. It must show that the historical record itself answers the earlier skepticism. The unit was not effective in spite of a lack of evidence. It was effective in ways the evidence preserves. Sortie totals preserve it. Decorations preserve it. Redesignation preserves it. The duration of service preserves it. Even the survival of so many later recollections exists partly because the regiment endured long enough and achieved enough to become recordable beyond rumour. Yet this validation does not produce a simple ending. Recognition inside wartime systems is not the same as durable presence in broader public memory. A regiment can be decorated and still later be marginalized. It can be institutionally legible in one era and historically dimmed in another. That tension is important because it prevents outcome from pretending to be closure. The record proves that the night witches mattered. It does not guarantee that they would remain centrally remembered. What outcome does offer instead is proof. It shows that the night witches were not a symbolic aside to the war, nor an anecdote inflated by later fascination. They were a functioning combat regiment whose record can be traced in missions flown, honours granted, and service sustained. Their achievement becomes clearest when stripped of legend and returned to structure. What they validated was not merely their own endurance, but the larger thesis the book has been building toward. Force does not have to be heavy to be consequential. Under certain conditions, persistence, timing, and precision can become legible as power in the most formal way war knows how to record.
Natalia Mecklin is especially useful at this point in the story because her life helps connect combat validation with later remembrance. She served as a pilot in the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment and flew hundreds of combat sorties, placing her firmly inside the regiment's defining operational rhythm. Repeated night approach, release, return, refuel, rearm, and departure again. Her wartime record reflects the same pattern the larger chapter has been tracing. Validation, in her case, was not abstract. It attached to repeated service carried out over time. Mecklin was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, one of the highest distinctions available in the wartime Soviet system. That award matters here not because it flatters biography, but because it makes visible how individual service within the regiment entered the formal machinery of recognition. Her record stands as one example among several that the unit's performance was legible not only to later historians, but to wartime institutions themselves. She is also important because she helps open the door to the next section. After the war, Mecklin became part of the written memory of the regiment. In her, action and recollection begin to meet. She belongs to the combat record, but she also belongs to the afterlife of that record in language. That dual function makes her an especially fitting figure for outcome. She sharpens the point that validation occurred, but also prepares us for the next question. If so much was recorded, honoured, and remembered by participants themselves, why did the story still become uneven in wider historical memory?
The record proves that the night witches mattered. Their effectiveness can be traced in sorties flown, service sustained, honours granted, and status earned. But outcome is not the same as permanence. Recognition inside war does not guarantee durable visibility afterward. That tension now has to be followed into memory, omission, and the structures by which some wartime stories remain central, while others recede.
When the flying stops, the body does not understand it at once. It still wakes for motion. It still expects the call, the sequence, the lamplit field. the cold against the face before takeoff. Hands that learned through repetition do not easily accept stillness. The night remains in the nerves longer than the war remains in the sky. There are uniforms to fold, documents to sign, trains to take, rooms to enter that do not know what the darkness required. The work that once ordered every hour ends, and in its place comes something less visible and less exacting in its demands, but harder to measure. People ask different questions now, if they ask at all. They ask whether one is married, where one will live, what one will do next. They do not ask how many times the engine was cut, or what the air sounded like when the aircraft gave itself to the glide, or how often fatigue and attention had to occupy the same body at once. The war becomes larger in public speech and smaller in individual memory. A regiment dissolves into categories. A method collapses into a name. A name becomes a story told by someone who was not there.
Recognition does not end with the war, but it changes form as soon as the war's immediate use has passed. What had been preserved in orders, citations, and military structure must now survive in memory, publication, translation, and public attention. It is here that the night witches enter a second history, one not of flight, but of visibility. The question in this section is not whether they mattered. The previous section has already answered that. The question is what happened once their wartime significance had to live beyond the system that had measured and rewarded it. After the war, the women of the regiment entered civilian life in the way so many veterans do, not by crossing a clean threshold, but by dispersing. The structure that had once given their work immediate clarity no longer existed in the same form. The airfields, the operational tempo, the nightly repetition, the shared conditions of exposure and responsibility, these were replaced by the fragmented rhythms of post-war life. Some married, some continued in professions connected to aviation, military service, engineering, education, or writing. Some carried their wartime experience into memoir, remembrance, or veterans associations. Others became less publicly visible, even while the war remained central to the shape of their lives. This transition matters because it reveals a difference between wartime recognition and peacetime visibility. During the war, the regiment's meaning was tied to function. It had a place, a mission, and a measurable role. After the war, that functional clarity no longer guaranteed a comparable place in public consciousness. Demobilization redistributed not only people, but attention. Histories of the war hardened into broader narratives of fronts, armies, campaigns, and state power. Within such accounts, highly specific formations, especially those that sat at the intersection of aviation history, women's military service, and Soviet wartime experience, could become less visible without ever having been unimportant. The night witches were not wholly forgotten within the Soviet sphere. Their service remained part of military memory, veterans culture, commemorative practice, and published recollection. Recognition had been real, and traces of that recognition persisted. Yet persistence within one memory structure is not the same as broad international familiarity. The women returned from war to a world in which their deeds had to compete with larger and more conventional narratives of mechanized conflict. Heavy bombers, tank battles, great offensives, and better-known male commanders occupied a more secure place in post-war historical imagination. The night witches belonged to the war's documented record, but they did not automatically become central to the way the war would later be told. There is also a practical dimension to this shift. Wartime institutions preserve service in one way. Public memory preserves it in another. Orders, decorations, and regiment histories can confirm that something happened. They do not by themselves ensure that later generations will encounter it with any depth. What moves easily through institutional record does not always move easily through international publishing, translation, education, or popular history. In that sense, what happened after the war was not a simple collapse into silence. It was a narrowing. The women remained present in some archives, memoirs, commemorations, and specialist studies, but unevenly present in the wider historical imagination. That unevenness is important because it resists a simpler and less accurate story. The night witches were not erased in the sense of disappearing completely, nor were they retained in proportion to the distinctiveness and significance of their record. Their afterlife sits between those extremes. They were remembered, but not evenly, preserved, but not centrally, named, but often without the operational depth that would make the meaning of that name fully clear. The shift from war to peace did not invalidate their contribution. It changed the structures through which that contribution could be seen. This is where the problem of memory begins to sharpen. Once the immediate wartime need was gone, the women's history had to survive through forms less stable than combat record. Testimony, publication, commemoration, scholarship, and transmission across political and linguistic boundaries. That survival did occur, but it did not occur with equal force everywhere, and it did not protect the story from distortion, flattening, or partial omission. The limited visibility of the night witches in broader public memory cannot be explained by any single cause. It is better understood as the result of several filters acting together over time. One of the most basic is language. Much of the material necessary to understand Soviet women aviators in depth remained for years less accessible to English-language audiences than more familiar Western wartime narratives. Memoirs, archival traces, military records, and Soviet-centered scholarship did not always move easily across translation boundaries. When stories travel unevenly between languages, they do not disappear, but they often arrive thinned, delayed, or reduced to their most striking surface elements. Cold War separation intensified this problem. The war had been fought in alliance, but much of its memory was later organized through political worlds that no longer spoke to one another openly or sympathetically. Soviet history did not circulate neutrally in the English-speaking West, and stories emerging from Soviet institutions often reached outside audiences through suspicion, simplification, or selective interest. This did not mean the night witches were unknowable. It meant that the conditions under which they could become widely known were less favorable than those enjoyed by stories already embedded in Anglo-American memory structures. A regiment could be well documented and still remain peripheral to the narratives most commonly taught, published, and repeated elsewhere. Gender also shaped the filtering process, though it should be handled carefully. The issue is not that women's wartime service was invisible in every context, nor that the night witches were ignored simply because they were women. The issue is that military memory has often privileged certain kinds of visibility: large machines, decisive battles, high command, and familiar models of masculine combat heroism. The night witches fit awkwardly within those expectations. They were aviators, but not associated with the kinds of aircraft most celebrated in popular air war history. They were combat personnel, but not easily absorbed into conventional images of military prestige. Their story challenged assumptions about who fights, what counts as force, and what kinds of military action are remembered as central. This helps explain why the nickname traveled more easily than the method. Night Witches is memorable. It is vivid, portable, and dramatic. It can survive in popular retelling, even when the operational logic beneath it is lost. That, in some ways, is part of the problem. A striking name can preserve visibility while also distorting it. The women become a legend before they are understood as an air regiment, operating under material constraint with tactical discipline and measurable effectiveness. Myth, in this case, does not erase memory altogether. It can displace understanding with atmosphere. There are also structural reasons tied to post-war organization of memory itself. Not every decorated unit becomes central in school curricula, museum narratives, documentary traditions, and mass-market publishing. Public memory is selective not only because individuals forget, but because institutions choose what to foreground. Stories that align cleanly with national identity, dominant language networks, available archives, and familiar narrative forms tend to remain more visible. Stories that cross ideological divides, depend on translation, or require readers to revise inherited assumptions often remain more marginal, even when the underlying record is strong. The Night Witches sit precisely at that difficult intersection. They belong to Soviet history, women's history, aviation history, and the history of operational adaptation under wartime constraint. That should make them more visible. In practice, it often means they fall between categories. Too specialized for broad popular memory, too often simplified for legend, and too frequently treated as an unusual anecdote rather than a serious case of military effectiveness. They remain less widely known than the documentary record would seem to justify. This is why the problem should be understood as structured omission rather than simple neglect. The record exists, recognition existed, testimony exists, scholarship exists. What has been uneven is the transmission. The women were not absent from history. They were unevenly carried through it. Their story survived, but not always in forms that preserved its full scale, its operational intelligence, or its challenge to conventional ideas about how effectiveness is achieved and remembered. That uneven transmission is precisely what makes the story important now. The Night Witches do not merely add another neglected unit to the archive of World War II. They expose something about the archive itself. They show that military memory does not preserve significance automatically, and that recognition in one era does not guarantee centrality in another. Their partial erasure is therefore not only a problem of fairness, though it is also that. It is a problem of historical understanding. When their story is reduced, the larger history of the war is reduced with it. The contradiction is now fully visible. The regiment was real, measurable, decorated, and operationally effective. Yet its place in wider memory remains thinner than those facts would predict. That tension leads directly into the closing frame. If history has not always remembered the Night Witches in proportion to what they accomplished, then the final question is no longer only about them. It is about the standards by which effectiveness itself is recognized, narrated, and preserved.
The engine is cut before the target, as it has been before. The sound falls away, not all at once, but enough that the air takes over. Wind moves across the wings, steady and indifferent. The aircraft no longer pulls forward in the same way. It settles into something quieter, something that requires attention rather than force. Hands remain where they have always been. The body does not change its work because the war is near its end or because the years that will follow are waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. There is only the descent, the line held in darkness, the timing that must be right. Below, the ground is not a place, but a pattern of absence and interruption. Light appears where it should not. Darkness thickens where it should be thin. The map is not seen. It is remembered, corrected, and held against what can be sensed in the moment. There is no space here for anything unnecessary, not for explanation, not for recognition, not for what will later be said about this work or how it will be remembered. The release is felt more than seen. Weight leaves the aircraft. The motion changes. There is a brief interval in which nothing else happens, and then the engine returns. Not as interruption, but as continuation. The aircraft turns. The field must be found again. The next cycle waits. It always has.
Across the preceding sections, the same pattern has appeared in different forms. It began as constraint, visible in the mismatch between the regiment and the war it entered. It became adaptation, as training compressed time and skill into usable competence. It clarified into method, as low-altitude flight, manual navigation, and the controlled glide formed a repeatable system. It deepened into pattern. As repetition replaced singular force, it expanded into effect, as accumulation produced pressure beyond the scale of any one sortie. It carried cost, visible in exposure, loss, and the demands placed on the body. It reached validation, preserved in record and recognition, and then it shifted again, entering memory unevenly, carried forward in some forms and reduced in others. Taken together, these movements allow a clearer understanding of what effectiveness meant in this case. It was not the product of overwhelming power. It did not depend on speed, armor, or the ability to dominate the airspace in conventional terms. The regiment did not succeed by becoming something closer to the dominant model of wartime aviation. It remained outside that model and developed a way of operating that made use of what was available rather than waiting for what was not. This distinction matters because it resists a familiar simplification. Effectiveness is often described in terms that assume scale. More force, greater speed, heavier payload, broader reach. Those measures are not irrelevant. They shaped much of the war. But they do not account for all of it. The night witches demonstrate a different configuration. They show that a system can produce meaningful and measurable results, not by exceeding constraints, but by aligning with them precisely enough that repetition becomes possible, and by maintaining that alignment long enough for accumulation to take hold. What emerges is a model in which timing replaces immediacy, recurrence replaces spectacle, and precision replaces excess. The regiment's operations did not appear decisive in isolation. A single sortie did not alter the structure of the war. But the method allowed for return, and return allowed for continuation, and continuation allowed for pressure that could not be easily dismissed or entirely absorbed. In that sense, effectiveness was not located in any one moment. It was distributed across time. This is why we have resisted treating the night witches as an exception to the logic of warfare. They are not a contradiction of it. They are an instance of it expressed differently. The same war that rewarded scale also contains space for a method that operated through repetition and constraint. The difference is not between effectiveness and ineffectiveness. It is between different ways of producing effect, some more visible than others, some more easily remembered than others, but all grounded in the relationship between means, method, and sustained application. The record confirms that this alternative configuration was not theoretical. It was enacted, maintained, and recognized. The regiment's history, therefore, does more than add a missing detail to the broader account of the war. It complicates the terms through which that account is usually understood. It shows that effectiveness cannot be reduced to the most obvious measures of power, and that what is most visible is not always what is most structurally significant. The glide returns at the end because it has been present throughout, even when not named. It is there in the method, in the repetition, in the measured application of force, in the space between action and outcome, where timing matters more than intensity. To return to it now is not to repeat the opening, but to see it with the weight of everything that has been established. The aircraft is again without engine for a moment. The air holds it. The descent is controlled, not rushed. Nothing in the scene has changed in its physical form. The same materials, the same limitations, the same exposure. What has changed is what can be understood within it. The glide is no longer a single act carried out in darkness. It is part of a system that has been traced from experience to record to recognition, and from recognition into the uneven structures of memory. Seen in this way, the moment does not ask to be elevated into symbol. It does not require enlargement or embellishment. It is sufficient as it is, a precise adjustment inside constraint, repeated until it becomes effective, sustained until it becomes visible, and carried forward until it becomes part of history, even if that history does not preserve it evenly. The return to the glide closes the movement of the book. because it holds together what has been separated across the chapters. Experience and analysis meet here without needing to be forced into agreement. The body that performs the action and the record that preserves it describe the same structure from different positions. One does not replace the other. Each makes the other legible. There is no final argument beyond this. We do not end by expanding its claim, but by allowing it to settle. Effectiveness, as shown here, is not how much force exists. It is how precisely and how consistently it is applied over time.